The high desert wind carried the scent of blood and burnt powder long before Daniel Reed saw the wagon. It was a dry, scouring wind, the kind that came down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in late October, promising a hard winter. He rode his horse, a solid buckskin gelding named Sully, with the easy posture of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He was not looking for trouble, he was checking his trap lines. But trouble was the primary crop of New Mexico territory. He found the wreck in a shallow arroyo, 10 miles shy of the Santa Fe Trail. It was a missionary wagon, or had been. One wheel was splintered, the canvas cover was scorched and flapping, and the mules were dead in their traces, throats cut. 2 men lay nearby, black-frocked and pale, their eyes wide with the surprise of meeting their makers so violently. Bandits. Apaches would have taken the mules. Daniel dismounted, rifle in hand, his gaze sweeping the rocks. Nothing moved. The raid was over, hours old. The bandits had been thorough, splitting open sacks of flour and beans, taking whatever ammunition and whiskey they could find. He nudged a body with his boot. The preacher. He'd seen him in town once, shouting about damnation and the heathen soul. A sound, small and thin, cut through the wind. A scraping, like iron on stone. He moved toward the back of the wagon, his steps quiet, and he saw her. She was chained to the rear axle. The chain was heavy, meant for livestock, and the iron cuff around her ankle was raw and bloody. She was Apache, young, maybe 18 or 19 years old. She wore the ragged remnants of a calico dress, but it was stiff with dried blood from a gash on her forehead. She was barely conscious, her black hair matted with dirt, her lips cracked and white. When she saw his shadow fall over her, she flinched, a low sound of pure terror rattling in her chest. She tried to scramble backward, but the chain snapped her short, digging into her flesh. Daniel stopped. He lowered the rifle. He saw the marks on her, the old bruises on her arms, the fresh terror in her eyes. The preacher had not been saving her soul. He had been using her, or selling her. The bandits had either missed her or simply left her to die. He holstered the rifle and moved slowly, holding his hands up, palms out. "Easy," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. I won't hurt you." She stared at him, her eyes bottomless, taking in his worn union coat, the beard shadowing his jaw, the sadness he carried like a second skin. He went to his saddlebag and pulled out his canteen and a heavy file. He offered the water first. She watched the canteen, her gaze fixed on the movement of his throat as he swallowed to show her it was safe. He set it on the ground, just within her reach, and stepped back. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She drank, spilling half of it, her body shaking with the effort. When it was empty, she let it fall. Daniel knelt by the chain. "This will make noise," he said, mostly to himself. He set the file to the iron link. Every rasp of the metal made her jump. It took him near 20 minutes, the sun beating on his back, the file hot in his hands. He worked steadily, his knuckles scraping against the wagon bed, until the link finally gave way with a sharp snap. The chain fell away. She did not move. She just stared at the broken link, then at him, as if she could not understand the concept of being free from it. "Can you stand?" he asked. She said nothing. He wasn't even sure if she understood the words. He reached for her, and she recoiled, pulling her knees to her chest. "All right," he said, sighing. "All right, I'm not them." He stood up and turned his back to her, a deliberate show of non-aggression. He walked to his horse, rummaged in his bedroll, and came back with a strip of jerky and an old wool blanket. He set them down near her, well out of his own reach. He waited. He sat on a rock 20 feet away and watched the sun creep toward the western mesas. It was a long time before she moved. First, she ate the jerky, tearing at it like a starved wolf. Then, slowly, painfully, she pulled herself to her feet, using the broken wagon wheel for support. She was small, thin as a willow switch, but she stood straight. She looked at him, then at the vast, empty desert around them. There was nowhere to go. Daniel stood. "You come with me. You'll be safe." You stay here. You'll be dead by morning. Coyotes or the cold. He mounted Sully. He waited, the buckskin shifting under him. He knew he should ride on. Taking her in was a fool's errand. It was borrowing a fight with every settler, every soldier, and the territory government itself. He was a man who wanted only to be left alone, to nurse the wound that had never healed. He looked at her again, at the high cheekbones and the dark, almond-shaped eyes. And he was not in the arroyo anymore. He was 5 years gone, in a small cabin near Taos, watching his wife, Elara, her hand gripping his, her face pale with sweat. She had been mixed blood, Comanche and Irish, a woman who understood both the prairie and the parlor. He had loved her with a force that terrified him. He had lost her in that cabin, lost her and the child she was birthing, their daughter, who had taken one breath and then fallen silent. The Apache girl in the dirt had Elara's eyes, not the color, but the same look of a soul caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He was not a hero. He was not a good man. Not anymore. He was just a man haunted. He could not save Elara, but he could not ride away from her ghost. "Come on," he said, his voice softer. He held out his hand. She watched him for another full minute. Then, with halting, painful steps, her bare feet bleeding on the stones, she walked to him. She did not take his hand. She just stood beside the horse, waiting. Daniel leaned down, hooked an arm around her waist, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her back pressed against his chest. She was rigid, a block of ice, trembling so hard he could feel it in his own bones. He wrapped the old blanket around her, tucked it tight, and turned Sully's head toward the mountains. "You're safe," he whispered to the wind, or perhaps to himself. "It's all right." She did not make a sound the entire ride home. His homestead was high up, nestled in a small valley where the pinon pines gave way to aspen and spruce. It was isolated, a full day's ride from Santa Fe, and that was how he liked it. The cabin was sturdy, built of timber he had cut and hewn himself, with a stone chimney and a deep porch. A small barn and a fenced-in corral stood nearby. It was a lonely place, a place to forget the world. He slid off the horse and reached up for her. She let him take her, her body pliant and cold. He carried her inside and set her down on the single chair by the cold hearth. The cabin was one room, a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves of tins and books. The air was stale, smelling of old smoke and male solitude. The girl's eyes darted everywhere. She looked at the locked rifle rack, the empty cot, the way the door bolted from the inside. She was a captive animal, measuring the dimensions of a new cage. "My name is Daniel," he said, striking a match and lighting the kindling in the fireplace. "Daniel Reed." She said nothing. She watched the flames catch. "I need to clean that cut," he said. He went to the sink, poured water from the basin into a small pot, and set it on the hook over the fire to warm. He pulled a tin from a shelf. Salve. When he approached her with the wet cloth, she flinched and raised her hands to protect her face. "Easy, now," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just water, just cleaning the dirt." He moved slowly. He dabbed at the blood on her forehead. The cut was shallow but dirty. She hissed when the warm water touched it, but she let him clean it. He put a dab of the stinging salve on it. Her skin was hot. She had a fever. "You need to eat something better than jerky," he said. He made a thin gruel from cornmeal and water, adding a spoonful of molasses for strength. He held the bowl out to her. She stared at it. "Food," he said. "Eat." She took the bowl and ate, her eyes never leaving him. When she was done, she set the bowl on the floor. Night was falling. The wind howled outside, a high, lonely sound. The cabin was warming up, but the girl, Tyan, though he did not know her name, was still shaking. "You can have the cot," he said, pointing to it. "It's warm. I'll take the floor." She looked at the cot, a simple frame with a straw-stuffed mattress and several thick wool blankets. She looked at him. Then she shook her head, a short, Sharp, negative. "It's safe," he said. "I won't. I sleep on the floor." She stood up, walked to the door, and unbolted it. She slipped outside into the freezing dark. Daniel cursed under his breath. He grabbed a blanket and followed her. She had huddled on the porch, her back against the cabin wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You'll die out here," he said, frustrated. "It's going to snow before morning. Get inside." She pressed herself harder against the wall, her eyes pleading. He understood. The room had one door. He was a man. She had been in locked rooms with men before. He threw the blanket over her. "Stubborn," he muttered. He went back inside, leaving the door cracked open, and sat in the chair, watching the fire. He did not sleep. He heard her coughing around midnight. Just before dawn, when the frost was a thick white pelt on the ground, he went out. She was asleep, but it was a bad sleep. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was icy. He scooped her up. She was too weak to fight. He carried her inside, laid her on the cot, and piled every blanket he owned on top of her. He built the fire up until it was roaring, and he sat beside her, bathing her face with a cool cloth as the fever took hold. She was sick for 4 days. She woke in terror, shouting in a language he didn't know, fighting shadows. He held her down gently, forcing water and thin broth between her lips. He did not sleep, except in the chair for an hour at a time. He talked to her, the sound of his voice seeming to soothe the panic. He told her about the homestead, about his horse, about the way the weather turned. He did not talk about Alara. On the 5th day, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him. Her eyes were clear, the terror replaced by a deep, bottomless caution. She was still wary of the cabin, so he found a compromise. The back porch was deep, used for storing wood and tools. He spent 3 days enclosing it. He sawed timber, nailed planks, and sealed the cracks with mud and straw. He built a small, crude fireplace of river stone and clay, venting it with a pipe through the roof. He moved the cot into the new room. It was small, barely big enough to stand in, but it was hers. It had its own door to the outside and a latch on the inside. When he was done, he showed it to her. He pointed to the latch. "Yours," he said. "You lock it." She touched the wooden latch. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. That night, she slept in the little room, and he heard the sound of the latch sliding into place. He began to gain her trust, not with words, but with routine. He left a plate of food on the porch rail 3 times a day. He'd knock, then walk away, letting her eat in private. He left small things where she would find them. One day, it was a bar of soap. Another, a comb. He'd seen her trying to untangle her hair with her fingers, a hopeless task. He left the comb on the wood pile. The next day, it was gone. He bought a warm wool shawl in town, a deep red color, and left it folded on her chair. That evening, he saw her sitting by her small fire, the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. He gave her space. He never approached her new room without knocking. He never looked at her for too long. He treated her not as a woman, or an Apache, or a captive, but as a wary animal he was trying not to spook. Slowly, she began to emerge. Winter closed in. The first snows dusted the peaks, and the aspens were bare skeletons. The work of survival was constant. Daniel chopped wood from dawn until his hands were raw. He repaired the fences on his corral. He ground his yearly supply of corn with a heavy stone quern. One morning, he was splitting logs when he felt her presence. She was standing 20 feet away, watching. He paused, the axe in his hand. She pointed to the axe. She said. It was the first word he'd heard her speak. He was hesitant. The axe was heavy, but he nodded. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the wood, how to let the weight of the tool do the work. She was clumsy at first, the blows glancing off, but she was determined. She worked until she was breathing hard, her small frame straining. He did not interfere. He just watched. The next day, she was there again. She picked up the smaller axe and began splitting kindling. She began to mimic all his chores. He would mend a section of fence, and she would be there, holding the post steady while he tamped the earth. He would grind corn, and she would take a turn, her body moving with a steady, grinding rhythm. She was quiet, always quiet, but her intensity was unnerving. She watched his hands. She studied how he tied a knot, how he cleaned his rifle, how he banked the fire at night. She was learning him. They worked side by side for weeks, often without a single word passing between them. The silence changed. It was no longer the tense, frightened silence of her arrival. It became a shared silence, a language of mutual labor. The homestead, which had been his prison of grief, began to feel like a shared space. One night, the wind was a living thing, slamming against the cabin walls. The snow was deep outside. He had brought her into the main cabin for warmth, the fire in her small room not enough to fight the deep cold. She sat on the floor, on the bearskin rug, watching the flames. He sat in his chair, mending a bridle, his hands stiff. He had a scar on the back of his right hand, a puckered white mark where a hot iron had branded him during the war. He rubbed it, a nervous habit. She moved, crawling silently over the rug. She stopped beside his chair. He tensed, but did not pull away. She reached out, her fingers light as a moth's wing. She traced the scar on his hand. Her touch was warm, and it sent a jolt through him, a feeling so long forgotten it almost hurt. He had not been touched with tenderness in 5 years. He looked down at her. She was staring at his hand, her expression one of simple, unfiltered curiosity. Her English was still broken, learned from listening to him mutter to his horse and to himself, but her words, when they came, were clear. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "Does your heart sleep alone?" Daniel froze. The question was a perfectly aimed arrow, slipping past all his defenses. It was too intimate, too true. He had no answer for her, none that would not break him open. He saw Ilara's face in the fire, felt the phantom weight of a swaddled infant in his arms. He gently pulled his hand from her grasp. He stood up, his movement stiff. He turned from her, busying himself with the fire, poking at logs that did not need poking. "It's late," he said, his voice thick. "You should sleep." She watched him for a moment longer, then rose and slipped back into her own room. He heard the soft slide of the latch. Daniel did not go to bed. He stood by the cold window, staring out at the white, empty darkness. He had not cried in 5 years, not since the day he buried his wife and child. He did not cry now. He just felt the great, cold weight of his solitude, a weight that, for one brief moment, another person had offered to share. That night, when he finally fell onto his cot, he dreamed. He dreamed of holding someone, of the warmth of a body pressed against his, of the scent of wood smoke and pine, and the simple, uncomplicated peace of not being alone. He woke before dawn, the ache in his chest sharper than any winter cold. Winter's grip on the high desert did not break, but it loosened. The sun, which for months had been a pale, distant coin, began to carry a fragile warmth. Snowmelt trickled from the roof and the ground, frozen iron hard for 100 days, softened to a thick, cold mud. The weight of the snows had damaged the cabin. A section of the south roof, over the main room, had sagged. Daniel knew it was the support beam, cracked under the load. It was a clear, cold afternoon when he finally set to fixing it. He'd brought the new timber inside, braced the ceiling, and begun the hard work of chiseling out the old, damaged wood. It was heavy, hot labor. The cabin, with the fire banked low, became stuffy. First, he shed his heavy wool coat. An hour later, his flannel shirt was dark with sweat and sticking to his back. He grunted, pulling the shirt over his head and tossing it onto his chair. The cold air hit his skin, and it was a relief. He went back to work, his back to the room, his arms raised as he worked the chisel and mallet, the muscles in his shoulders and back bunched and released, the product of years of solitude and hard, physical survival. He was so focused on the task, on the precise angle of the cut, that he did not hear her enter. He only knew she was there when she spoke, her voice quiet but so close it made him jolt, nearly dropping the heavy mallet. Your skin is not like mine. He turned, balancing precariously on the stool. Tyan stood just behind him, her head tilted, her gaze intense and unnervingly analytical. She was not looking at his face. She was staring at his chest. Daniel felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. He was not a modest man, but this was different. Her stare was not shy, nor was it flirtatious. It was the look of a student examining a new and complicated subject. It's just work. It's hot, he stammered, reaching for the shirt. She held up a hand, a small, sharp gesture that stopped him. No, I see. She took a step closer. He was trapped on the stool, the beam above him, her scrutiny upon him. The hair is dark, but the skin is white, she observed, as if noting the difference between pine and aspen. She watched the muscles in his arms as he held the tools. It moves, under the skin. Tyan, it's not proper, he said, his voice strained. She ignored him, her gaze traveling from his shoulders to his abdomen. She saw the old, faded scars from his time in the war, the white lines that crisscrossed his ribs. Her eyes were full of a profound, almost scientific curiosity. Is this why white women want babies? The question struck him silent. He could only stare at her. What? The chest, she said, gesturing with her chin. It is strong. They see this. They want a child from a strong man. To be safe. This is why? He laughed, a short, sharp, nervous sound. He dropped from the stool, snatching his shirt from the chair and pulling it on, fumbling with the buttons. No, that's not. People don't have children because a man's got a strong chest. It's more complicated than that. Why? It just is. It's about family. It's about love, I suppose. He finished the buttons, feeling armored again, though her gaze had not softened. Love, she repeated. The word sounded foreign on her tongue, an object she was tasting for the first time. Love is strength? Sometimes, he said, turning back to the beam, his face hidden from her. Now, I need to finish this before the cold sets in. She did not leave. She sat on the floor, her back against the far wall, and watched him work for another hour. Her question had unsettled something in him. It was the innocence of it, the way she cut through all the layers of politeness and ritual he was used to and struck at the bare, simple truth. He was strong. He had survived. And she, who had survived nothing but cruelty, was trying to understand the mechanics of his world, his body, with the same intensity she applied to setting a snare or grinding corn. From that day, the nature of her questions changed. The wall of respectful distance he'd so carefully built between them began to crumble, breached not by him, but by her relentless, guileless curiosity. They were mending a fence line, the air so cold their breath plumed in front of them. He was wrapping wire, his gloves off for the delicate work. Your hands are rough, she said, touching the back of his wrist. He pulled his hand back. It's from the work, he said. Mine are rough, too, she said, holding hers out. They were calloused, the nails broken. But yours are big. They can hold the axe. They can hold the rifle. Can they hold a small thing? A bird? I suppose so. Tyan, we have work to do. Another time, they were eating their supper, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. Why do you not sing? She asked. He looked up from his plate of beans. I'm not a singer. The men in my tribe, they sing when they are proud, when they are sad. Your heart is sad, but you do not sing. I've got nothing to sing about, he said curtly. You have this house. You have the horse. You have me. The last three words hung in the air. He had no answer for them. The tension in the small cabin grew thick. It was a living thing, an unspoken awareness that filled the space between them. He felt her eyes on him when he thought she wasn't looking. He was intensely aware of her smell, a clean scent of wood smoke and the wild sage she sometimes crushed in her hands. He found himself thinking of Alara less, and when he did, her face blurred, sometimes replaced by Tyan's dark, watching eyes. He fought it with a grim, stubborn desperation. This was wrong. He was her protector. She was a refugee, a victim. She was Apache, and he was white. The world outside this small, isolated valley would see it as a sin, a crime. The men in town would call her a squaw. They would call him something worse. He was nearly 40. She was barely 20. He was taking advantage of her gratitude, of her loneliness. He tried to be colder. He spoke to her less, kept his gaze fixed on his chores. But his distance only seemed to make her more determined. She was like a plant seeking the sun, and she had decided he was it. The spring thaw finally came in earnest. The creek, which had been a ribbon of ice, swelled into a rushing, muddy torrent. The air was still sharp, but the need for a real bath, one that wasn't a sponge and a cold basin in the cabin, was overwhelming. Daniel took his rifle and a bar of lye soap and headed down to the sheltered bend in the creek, where the water pooled deeper. He told himself he was going to hunt, but he left Tyann at the cabin. He needed a moment alone, away from her presence. The water was so cold it stole his breath. He stripped and waded in, his body rebelling at the shock. He scrubbed himself quickly, the harsh soap biting his skin. He was washing his hair, his head dunked under the water, when he surfaced and found her standing on the bank. She was holding his towel. "Jesus!" he yelled, stumbling back into the deeper water, dunking himself to his shoulders. "Tyann, what are you doing here? Get back to the cabin." "You hunt," she said, her voice calm. "But you bring soap." He felt the blood rush to his face, a heat that had nothing to do with the icy water. "Go, now!" She did not go. She sat on a rock, her back to him, and waited. He was trapped. He could not get out without exposing himself. He stayed in the freezing water until his teeth were chattering and his feet were numb. "Damn it, woman! Turn around! All the way!" He heard her shift. He waited. "I am turned." He climbed out, his skin blue, and grabbed the towel, wrapping it around his waist. He was shaking, as much from anger as from cold. "You can't do that. You can't just follow me. You must give a man his privacy." She stood and faced him. She looked at the towel, then at his chest, then at his face. "You were dirty. Now you are clean. I do not understand privacy." "It means alone," he said through chattering teeth. "It means where people can't see you." "I see you every day," she said. "Why is this water different?" He had no answer. He dressed quickly, his fingers clumsy on the buttons. As he was pulling on his boots, she came closer. She knelt, her eyes fixed on his leg. He had forgotten about the scar. It was on his left thigh, a puckered, ugly knot of tissue where a Confederate mini-ball had torn through the muscle. Before he could react, she reached out and touched it. Her finger traced the edge of the wound. "This one was bad," she whispered. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice tight. He tried to pull his leg back, but she held it fast. She leaned down. Her black hair fell forward, brushing against his skin. She pressed her lips softly to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion. It was like her question about his chest. It was an act of acknowledgement, a reverence for the wound, for the fact that he had survived it. But it ripped through him like a bolt of lightning. He jerked his leg back so fast he almost kicked her. "No, don't ever do that!" He stood, grabbing his rifle. He stalked back to the cabin, leaving her by the creek. That night, the fragile peace between them was shattered. He sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle, pointedly ignoring her. She sat by her own fire in her small room. The door open. He could feel her watching him. The silence stretched, filled with his resistance and her confusion. Finally, she spoke, her voice small, coming from the shadows of her room. "The men." "Before the black coat." He stopped cleaning. He did not look at her. "What about them?" "They hurt me." He closed his eyes. He had known, of course. He had seen the terror in her that first day. But hearing her say it, here in the safety of his home, made his stomach clench. "They were white men, soldiers, maybe. They found me, after my family. They..." She struggled for the words. They put their hands on me. They did things. When they were done, they sold me to the preacher." He set the rifle down. He looked at her. She was just a shape in the shadows, illuminated by her own small fire. "Tyen," he said, his voice thick. "You don't have to. They hurt me," she repeated, her voice stronger now, as if saying it aloud gave it a shape he could understand. "It was cold. When they touched me, it was cold and hard, like stone." She stood and came into the main room, stopping a few feet from his chair. She looked at his shirt, at the place over his heart. "But not like you," she whispered. "You are warm." He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to hold her and tell her that nothing cold would ever touch her again. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that if he touched her now, he would be no different from them. She was not seeing him. She was seeing a protector, a source of heat. She was a half-drowned woman reaching for a log, and he could not let her mistake that for love. He stood, but he did not move toward her. He kept his hands at his sides, clenched into fists. "You are safe here, Tyen," he said, his voice rough. "I told you that. I meant it. No one will hurt you." "I am not hurt," she said, looking up at him. "I am safe, but I am not warm." She turned and went back to her room. And this time, he heard the wooden latch slide firmly into place. A week later, the storm came. It was not a winter blizzard, but a violent spring squall, the kind that brought the sky down to the earth. Rain and hail hammered the roof, driven by a wind that shrieked like a grieving woman. Thunder cracked overhead, so close the cabin shuddered. Daniel was checking the door latch when a bolt of lightning struck a pine tree on the ridge. The explosion of light and sound was simultaneous. The cabin was lit white for a second, and the crash was deafening. The door to Tyen's room flew open. She stood there, her eyes wide with terror, her hands pressed to her ears. The storms of her childhood, the thunder of guns, the violence of men, it was all one and the same to her. "It's just lightning. Tyen, it's all right," he shouted over the wind. She ran to him, not to his chair, but to his cot, where he had been preparing to sleep. She scrambled onto it and buried her face in his blankets, her body shaking violently. Daniel sighed. He sat on the edge of the cot, rubbing her back in a clumsy, paternal way. "It'll pass. It's just a storm." "Hold me," she whimpered, her voice muffled by the wool. He hesitated, but the cabin shook again, and she cried out. He slid onto the cot, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her as he would a frightened child. He was still fully dressed, his boots on the floor. He pulled a blanket over both of them. "See, it's just noise," he said, his voice rumbling in her ear. She slowly relaxed. Her trembling subsided. They lay like that for a long time, the storm raging around them, the sound of the rain a deafening drum on the roof. He could feel her breathing, feel the warmth of her back through his shirt. It was a simple, profound comfort. He had not held another person in 5 years. He had forgotten what it felt like. He thought she had fallen asleep. The storm was easing, the thunder rolling away into the distant mountains. His own eyes were heavy. Then she moved. She turned in his arms, her body flush against his, her face inches from his in the dark. "Daniel," she whispered, "it's all right. Go to sleep." "No." She pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her palm. "I want to feel what women feel." His blood went cold, then hot. He knew exactly what she meant. "Tyen, no, this is not—" "I want the warm," she insisted, her voice no longer frightened, but full of that same direct, honest curiosity. She pushed herself up, her lips near his. "I want to know." He stopped her. He gripped her shoulders, firmly, and held her at arm's length. She was a shadow in the dark, but he could see the glint of her eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What those men did, they took something from you. What you're asking for now, it's not just the warm. It's not just to know. Do you understand me?" She stared at him, confused. "This," he said, his grip on her shoulders gentle but absolute. "This between a man and a woman. It's meant to be more than just heat. It's supposed to be a choice. It's supposed to be about tenderness, about safety. Not just safety from a storm, but safety with that person." He let out a breath. How could he explain this? "You deserve more than just heat. Tie-in. You deserve a choice, a real one. Not one you make in the dark, during a storm, because you're scared or because you're grateful I'm not them. It has to be more. I will not be just another man who takes from you." She was silent. He could feel the resistance in her, the incomprehension. She was offering the only thing she had, and he was refusing it. He felt her pull away. She slid off the cot. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, a silhouette against the fading storm. He could not read her expression. He had hurt her. He was sure of it. He had rejected her. Without a word, she went back to her room and quietly closed the door. He did not hear the latch. Daniel lay awake until dawn, his body aching with a tension that was both desire and shame. He had done the right thing. He had protected her, even from herself. But as the first gray light filled the cabin, he felt more alone than ever. He must have drifted off, because he woke to the smell of coffee and smoke. He sat up, his back stiff. The storm was gone. The cabin was quiet. He dreaded facing her. He expected her to be gone, to have run, or worse, to be back as she was when she first arrived. A silent, wary ghost. He got up and splashed cold water on his face from the basin. He opened the cabin door. Tyen was outside, feeding the chickens a handful of cracked corn. The morning air was washed clean, and the sun was bright. She seemed calm, her movements deliberate. He was about to speak, to apologize, to try and explain again. When she turned, he stopped. Her hair, it was not in the simple, loose braid she usually wore, the style of a young, unmarried girl. It was different. It was parted, pulled back tight, and woven into two intricate braids, which were then looped and tied up at the back of her head with a strip of his own cured leather. It was a style that was severe, complex, and elegant. It was the style of a woman. He just stared. She did not look at him directly. She scattered the last of the corn. "Your hair," he said, his voice a rasp. She finished her task and stood, her back straight. She looked toward the mountains. Not at him, but her voice was clear and steady, with no trace of the fear or the pleading from the night before. "In my tribe," she said, "this is how married women wear their hair." The silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer a space Daniel filled with his solitary thoughts, with Tyen a silent observer. It was their silence. Her new hairstyle was a declaration, a bold, quiet statement that he had no idea how to answer. He had refused her in the storm, and she had responded not with retreat, but with a symbolic claiming of a future he himself was too afraid to consider. He said nothing about it. He could not. To acknowledge it was to accept a new reality, and he was not ready. He continued his chores. He chopped wood. He repaired the corral. He hunted. She worked beside him, her presence a constant, warm weight. She still did not enter his space without invitation, but the line between her small room and his main cabin had blurred. The latch on her door remained unused, but the homestead could not remain an island forever. Spring was advancing, and their supplies, stretched thin by the long winter, were dwindling. He was out of salt, low on coffee, and dangerously low on ammunition. The ground was soft enough to plant, and he needed seed. He put off the trip to Santa Fe for as long as he could. It was not just the ride, it was the people. He had been a recluse for 5 years, visiting town only 4 or 5 times a year, a gaunt, bearded ghost who bought his supplies and spoke to no one. But he had been alone then. Now, he was not. He rode Sully hard, leaving at dawn, the buckskin sensing his urgency. He tried to tell himself that nothing had changed. He was just a homesteader going for supplies, but he knew it was a lie. He had been in town once, briefly, in the dead of winter, to buy the wool shawl for Tyen, He'd seen the looks he got from Silas, the storekeeper, who had asked why he, a man who never bought fixins, was suddenly interested in women's apparel. Daniel had ignored him, paid his coin, and left. But the seed of rumor had been planted. Santa Fe was busy. The plaza was thick with wagons, horses, and men back from wintering trap lines. The adobe storefront seemed to bake in the strengthening sun. He tied Sully outside the general store, his gaze low, his hat pulled down. He just wanted to get in and get out. The moment he pushed open the door, the talk stopped. Silas Cooper was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. 3 men were leaning against the far wall by the stove. Though it was unlit, he recognized them. Clay Hackett and Jeb Smith, 2 hands from the Miller Ranch, and a third man, a drifter he'd seen around. "Reed," Silas said, his voice flat, not welcoming. "Silas," Daniel nodded. He walked past the men, grabbing a sack of flour and another of beans. He moved to the counter, gathering salt, coffee, and 2 heavy boxes of .44 caliber cartridges. "Stocking up heavy," Clay Hackett observed. His voice was lazy, but it carried across the small store. Daniel ignored him. "Need corn seed, Silas, and rye." Silas moved to scoop the seed into brown paper sacks. "Heard you got company up on that ridge." "Reed." Jeb Smith chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the sawdust on the floor. "Heard you ain't so lonely anymore." Daniel's back stiffened. He kept his eyes on the counter. "My business is my own, Jeb. Not when it concerns a Christian soul," Clay said, pushing himself off the wall. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a mean, pinched mouth. "We heard what you did. Took that little Apache girl from Reverend Pike." "Reverend Pike bought her like cattle," Daniel said, his voice low and cold. "She was half dead. She was a convert," Clay sneered, stepping closer. "He was saving her. And you took her. Heard you're keeping her up there. For yourself. Ruining a good Christian girl." "She's not a girl," Daniel said, turning to face him. "And she's not yours to save, or his. She's a squaw," Hackett spat. "And you're no better than a buck for keeping her. Bet you're having a fine time, ain't you? After your half-breed wife died, you just had to get another one." The mention of Alara was a lit match to dry tinder. Daniel felt the blood roar in his ears, a hot, red tide that drowned out all reason. He didn't think. He moved. He hit Clay Hackett once, a straight, hard right born of military training and fury. It connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack of bone and cartilage. Hackett went down like a felled tree, crashing into a barrel of pickles. Jeb and the drifter lunged. Daniel was a soldier, not a brawler, but he was fast. He ducked under Jeb's wild swing and drove his fist into the man's stomach, doubling him over. The drifter tried to grab him from behind, but Daniel spun, throwing him off, and slammed his elbow into the man's face. It was over in seconds. The store was a wreck. Flour dusted the floorboards, and the sharp scent of brine filled the air. Clay Hackett was groaning, holding his jaw. Jeb was on his knees, gasping for air. The drifter was spitting blood. Daniel stood, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked at Silas, who was pale and wide-eyed behind the counter. He pulled a heavy leather poke from his coat and threw it on the counter. "Take what I owe. For the supplies and the pickles." He turned to the men on the floor. Clay was trying to get up, his eyes murderous. Daniel walked over to him and put his boot on the man's chest, pinning him. His voice was not a shout. It was a cold, quiet promise. "I don't know what you heard, and I don't care, but I'm telling you this once. She is under my protection. If any of you, or any man you send, comes near my home, if I so much as see your shadow on my land, I will kill you. I will put you in the ground and not think twice on it. Do you understand me?" He pressed his boot down harder. Clay choked, his eyes bulging, and nodded frantically. Daniel removed his boot. He grabbed his sacks of supplies, his ammunition, and his seed, and walked out. He mounted Sully and rode out of Santa Fe, not looking back. The ride home was long, the fury slowly cooling into a deep, cold ache. His hand throbbed. His eye was beginning to swell where the drifter's fist had grazed him. He was a fool. He had lost his temper. He had not just borrowed trouble. He had invited it home to supper. He had painted a target on his own back and on hers. He reached the homestead as the sun was bleeding into the western mesas. He was exhausted, sore, and heartsick. Tyan was waiting on the porch. She always knew, somehow, when he was close. She watched him dismount, her face calm. He pulled the heavy sacks from the horse, his movements stiff. She saw him turn. The light was fading, but she saw the purple-black swelling around his left eye. She saw the dried blood on his knuckles. She said nothing. She stepped back, holding the door open as he carried the supplies inside. He dropped them on the floor, his body slumping with fatigue. He sat heavily in his chair, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. He expected her to be afraid. He expected her to ask what happened, to show fear of the violence he had brought back with him. Instead, she went to the dry sink. She poured water from the basin into a small bowl, took a clean cloth, and walked to the medicine tin. She pulled out the familiar tin of salve. She knelt in front of him. He flinched when she reached for his face. "It's nothing, just a brawl." She ignored him. Her fingers, so small and delicate, were surprisingly firm. She dipped the cloth in the water and gently began to clean the cut on his knuckle. He hissed as the water stung. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice low. She cleaned his hand, her touch methodical. Then she moved to his face. She dabbed at the swelling, her touch impossibly light. He sat frozen, watching her. Her face was inches from his, her expression one of intense, unwavering focus. Her brows were knit, her lips pressed together. She was not afraid, she was angry, her hands were trembling. He saw it then. It was not fear, it was a fine, deep tremor, a rage that had nowhere to go. She finished cleaning the cut over his eye. She opened the salve and gently applied it to his skin. Her fingers were so light they barely touched him. "No one," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. She did not look up from her work. "No one ever bled for me." The words hit him harder than Hackett's fist. He realized, in that moment, that every man in her life had been a source of pain, a taker. He was the first one to ever take pain on her behalf. He reached up, his uninjured hand, and covered hers where it rested on his cheek. Her skin was warm. The trembling passed from her to him. "They won't come here," he said, his voice rough. "I made sure of that." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark, and in their depths, he saw something new. Not gratitude, not curiosity. It was a fierce, possessive, terrible understanding. She saw his wound not as a weakness, but as a brand. He had been marked. He was hers. That night, the space between them vanished. He was exhausted. He ate the stew she had prepared, his body demanding rest. He didn't bother to undress, just kicked off his boots and fell onto his cot, pulling a blanket over him. The cabin was dark. The fire banked to embers. The nightmare tore him from sleep hours later, but it was not his own. It was a scream, a thin, muffled sound of pure terror from her room. He was on his feet before he was awake, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept by the bed. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides and threw her door open. She was thrashing on her cot, tangled in her blankets, fighting an invisible enemy. "No," she was gasping, the word half Apache, half English. "Cold. No. Hinda. No." She was reliving it. The soldiers, the preacher, the men who had hurt her. "Tyan," he said, grabbing her shoulder. "Wake up. You're here. You're safe." Her eyes flew open. She did not recognize him. She saw a man, a shadow, and she screamed, lashing out, her nails raking his arm. "It's me," he shouted, pinning her wrists. "It's Daniel. You're safe. It's the cabin. You're home." Her name, his name, the word home. The panic in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a devastating, broken recognition. She collapsed, her body dissolving into sobs. a deep, racking sound of grief that he had never heard from her. She had been silent. She had been curious. She had been angry. She had never, until now, been broken. He pulled her up, blankets and all, and held her against his chest. He sat on her cot, rocking her like a child, his own aches forgotten. "I've got you," he whispered. "It's over. It's all over. They're gone. They can't hurt you." She cried for a long time, her face buried in his shirt, her hands gripping his arms as if he were the only solid thing on earth. When the sobs finally quieted, she was shaking from the cold and the shock. He could not leave her there. Not like this. He scooped her up, her body light as a child's, and carried her from her small, cold room into the main cabin, to his cot. He laid her down and pulled the heavy wool blankets over her. He started to move away, to take his blankets and sleep on the floor. Her hands shot out, grabbing his wrist. Her grip was iron. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice raw. "I'll be right here, on the floor." "No, in." She tugged at his arm. Hold me, like I'm yours." He looked at her. Her face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with tears. Her hair, the intricate braids of a married woman, had come loose on one side. She was not asking for heat. She was not asking for passion. She was asking for the promise he had made in town to be made real. She was asking for the safety his very body represented. He hesitated. This was the line he had sworn he would not cross. But the memory of her screams and the sight of her trembling broke his resolve. He slid into the cot, his back to her, and pulled her against him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "I'm here," he said. "Go to sleep. I've got you." She pressed her face against his back, her small body fitting against his. He felt her hands come to rest on his stomach, her fingers lacing together. He was intensely aware of her breathing, of the solid, living warmth of her. Something unspoken broke between them in the darkness. The line, the boundary between protector and possession, between solace and sin. It was gone. He did not know when he fell asleep, but he woke to the first light of dawn, his arms still wrapped around her, her body still held tight against his. She was sleeping, deeply and without fear. For the first time since he had known her, he woke her gently. The spell of the night was broken, and an awkwardness settled between them. She avoided his eyes. Her face flushed, and quickly retreated to her room to dress and rebraid her hair. He felt a sharp pang of guilt, but when she emerged, she was calm. The nightmare was gone, and something new was in its place. A few days later, he came in from the corral. He was stunned, and he stopped in the doorway. The cabin felt different. It was cleaner. His few books were stacked, but it was Tyen who held his gaze. She was standing by the quern, grinding corn. She was barefoot. She was wearing one of his old, threadbare flannel shirts. It was enormous on her, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, the hem brushing her knees, and she was humming. It was a low, repetitive, tuneless sound, a sound of pure, unthinking contentment. She was swaying with the rhythm of the grinding stone, her body lost in the motion. She looked up and saw him watching her. She did not flush. She did not look away. She just smiled, a small, slow smile that lit her eyes. He had seen her curious. He had seen her terrified. He had seen her angry. He had never, in all this time, seen her truly happy. The image of her, barefoot, wearing his shirt, humming in his home, was the most profoundly domestic thing he had ever witnessed. It stunned him. It was a vision of a life he had buried 5 years ago. He walked to her. He did not know what he was going to say. He reached out and touched her hair, the tight, married braid. "Tyen," he whispered. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "Daniel," she breathed. The tension, the longing he had fought for so many months was suddenly unbearable. He bent his head, and she rose on her toes. She stopped him. Her hand came up to his chest. "Wait," she whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with that same devastating curiosity he had seen before. But this time, her voice was fragile, uncertain. "So," she asked, her voice barely audible. "White people make children." "This way?" He froze, his heart hammering. It was the same question she had asked about his chest, but it was not the same. This was not an abstract inquiry. "This," he said, his voice thick, "is part of it. Yes." She held his gaze. "Can I try too?" He felt the world tilt, the innocence of the request, and the profound, bone-deep need behind it. She was not asking for sex. She was asking for a child, a family, a life, everything that had been stolen from her, everything he had lost. He was overwhelmed by his own longing, a desire so fierce it was almost painful. But he thought of his promise. He thought of the storm. He gripped her arms. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice raw. "Tyan, this is forever. This is not a game. This is—" "Are you sure?" She did not hesitate. She looked at him, her soul in her eyes. She put her hand against his scarred, bruised cheek. "I am sure," she whispered, and her yes. The last word she spoke was a whisper against his mouth. He kissed her. He lifted her, his hands buried in the soft flannel of his shirt, and carried her to his cot. It was nothing like his dreams. It was awkward. Their limbs were clumsy. He was rough from 5 years of solitude. She was hesitant, her only knowledge born of violence. But it was also a revelation. It was a raw, desperate hunger, a need to erase the cold, to claim a piece of life in a world that had offered them only death. He was gentle. He was tender. He whispered her name, over and over, like a prayer. And she was not the victim he had feared she would be. She was not passive. She was active. She was curious. She was strong. She was healing him. When it was over, they lay tangled in the blankets, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window. He held her, his heart too full to speak. He had crossed the line. He had broken every rule. She lay against his chest, her ear over his heart. She was quiet for a long time. "So," she whispered, her voice sleepy, "that is how it is warm." He kissed the top of her head, his eyes closing. "Yes," he said, "it's warm." The small, cold room off the porch was now used for storing cured hides and sacks of seed. Tyan slept in the cabin. She slept in his cot, her body a warm, solid presence against his back. The first few nights, he had lain awake, rigid, terrified of moving, of doing something wrong, but she slept with the deep, untroubled peace of a soul finally safe, her hand often reaching for his in the dark. Their life fell into a new rhythm, a shared domesticity that felt as ancient as the mountains around them. He would wake first, in the gray pre-dawn light, and his first sight was her face, peaceful in sleep, her black hair a spill of ink across his pillow. He would rise quietly, careful not to wake her, and build the fire. The scent of coffee and wood smoke would rouse her. She would emerge from the blankets, wrapped in his old flannel shirt, and they would sit at the small table, wordless, sipping the hot, bitter liquid as the sun lit the high peaks. He began to teach her. He was not a patient man by nature, but with her, he found a deep, slow patience he did not know he possessed. He started with the things around them. He took a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on the smooth, planed wood of the table, he wrote, "C-U-P, cup," he said, tapping the tin mug. She watched, her brow furrowed. P, she repeated, her tongue clumsy around the sounds. He wrote, F-I-R-E, fire, he said, pointing to the hearth. She said. She was a fierce student. She learned with the same intensity she had applied to chopping wood. She demanded more. He found an old, water-stained primer he had bought for Alara, and they sat by the fire at night, his large, scarred finger moving beneath the simple words, "The dog runs. The dog runs," she would repeat, her voice soft. One night, she looked up from the book, her eyes bright with a sudden, painful understanding. "Words," she whispered, touching the page. They stay. They do not." Go away, like breath. That's right, he said, his throat tight. They stay. They're a kind of memory. She touched the word love on the page. She had asked him what it meant, and he had tried to explain. It was what he felt for this cabin. It was what she felt for the sun. It was the warm. She had nodded, as if this made a kind of sense. Now, she traced the letters, Love. Love, she said, her pronunciation perfect. She looked at him. It stays. She, in turn, shared her own world. She no longer hummed her songs in private. She sang them, low and clear. As she worked, they were simple, melodic chants that spoke of the land. He asked her what they meant. This one, she said, her hands busy grinding corn, is for the corn. It asks the mother to wake up, to feed us. And that one, the one you sing when it rains? It is for the thunder, to thank him for washing the sky, so the deer can see. He tried to repeat the Apache words. His throat, used to the blunt, hard sounds of English, could not shape them. He butchered the sounds, and she stopped, her hand over her mouth. A sound bubbled up from her chest, a laugh. It was not a smile, not a quiet expression of contentment. It was a real, light, unrestrained laugh. The sound startled him. It was the first time he had heard true, uncomplicated joy in this cabin. It was a sound he wanted to hear again. The guilt for Alara had not vanished. It had simply shifted. It was no longer the sharp, isolating grief of his solitude. It was a quieter ache, a question of betrayal. He had loved his wife, and now he was building a new life, a new love, on the very land they were meant to share. He felt, one bright afternoon in early summer, that he could not move forward until he had reconciled the two. He took Tyann's hand. He said nothing, just led her from the cabin, past the corral, and up the small, pine-covered ridge that overlooked their valley. The grave was there, beneath the largest piñón. The wooden cross he had carved was gray and weathered. The mound of stones was undisturbed. Tyann stopped when she saw it. She knew what it was. Her people did not mark their dead this way, but she understood the meaning of a quiet, separate place. Daniel stood before it, his hat in his hands. This is Alara's grave, my wife. He spoke, his voice low, telling her about the woman who had been Comanche and Irish, who had loved this high, lonely country. He told her about the birth, about the long, terrible night, about the snow falling outside as he held his wife's cold hand and listened to the silence of the child who had never cried. I buried them here, he finished, his voice rough. Together. It was 5 years ago. Tyann listened, her gaze moving from his face to the wooden cross. She saw the story, not in his words, but in the lines around his eyes, in the permanent set of his shoulders. She understood. Finally, the source of the profound sadness he carried, the answer to her long-ago question, why does your heart sleep alone? It had not been alone. It had been buried here. She did not speak. She stepped past him to the grave, from a small leather pouch at her belt. She pulled a necklace. It was not a grand thing. It was a single, smooth, white shell, intricately carved with small, crossing lines, strung on a simple leather thong. It was one of the few possessions she had kept, a relic from a life he could not imagine. She bent and laid the shell necklace on the mound of stones, carefully, so it rested just beneath the carved name. She stood and faced him. She put her small, warm hand on his chest. She was first, Tyann said, her voice soft. She was sad. She let me have you now. Daniel looked from the white shell on the dark stones to Tyann's clear, steady eyes. He had expected her to be jealous or confused. He had not expected this, a simple, profound acceptance, a blessing. He felt a weight he had carried for 5 years, a weight of fidelity to a ghost. Suddenly lift, he pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time, he felt not like a man betraying a memory, but a man permitted to live again. The summer deepened, the heat settled in the valley. The corn they had planted was shoulder high. Their intimacy was a simple, unspoken fact, a rhythm as natural as the passing of the days. They woke together, they worked together, they slept together. He began to notice small changes. Tayan, who had a wolf's appetite for jerky and smoked meat, suddenly turned from it. One morning, the smell of bacon frying made her gag and run from the cabin. She was tired, more so than the work warranted. He would find her asleep in the shade of the porch in the middle of the afternoon. He thought she was sick, a summer fever. He worried. She, too, was confused. Her body felt alien to her. She was a person who knew the meaning of every subtle shift in the wind, every track in the dust. But the changes in her own self were a mystery. One night, she woke him, her hand gripping his arm. He bolted upright, reaching for the rifle, his heart pounding. "What is it? What's wrong?" "The dream," she whispered, her eyes wide in the dark. "A nightmare?" he asked, his panic easing. "No, not a bad dream." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. "It was different. You know I dream of the deer." He nodded. She had told him. Her nightmares were of running, of being chased. "Before," she said, her voice full of a strange awe. "The deer sees me. It is afraid. It runs away. Always, it runs." She turned to look at him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight. "Tonight, it did not run. It followed me. It walked beside me. In the aspens. It was not afraid. It was just with me." Daniel stared at her. The deer followed her, a quiet, companionable animal, a fawn. His mind, slow with sleep, began to work. The sickness in the morning, the weariness, the turning from the meat. He did not know much about these things, but he knew. He knew the basics. His voice was tight, almost a croak. "Tayan, your monthly time, your bleed." She looked at him, confused by the question. "It has not come. For how long?" she thought, her head tilted. "Since the snow melted? Since the night of the storm." The night of the storm. No, not that night. The night she had asked him. The day she had worn his shirt. He counted in his head. April, May, June. It was near the end of July. 2, maybe 3 months. The breath left his body. "Tayan," he said, his voice shaking. I think the deer, it means a child." She looked at him, uncomprehending. "A baby," he said, his hand moving, hovering over her stomach. You are carrying our child." Her eyes widened. Her own hand came up to cover his. She looked down at her belly, still flat beneath a thin nightshirt. A child. Her child. The idea was so foreign, so impossible. She had asked, "Can I try too?" As a child might ask to try a new food. She had not truly understood the consequence. "A baby," she whispered, testing the word. A small, slow smile, the one he had seen when she was grinding corn, spread across her face. "Our baby." Daniel felt two things at once. The first was a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, so fierce it was like a blow to the chest. A child, a son, a daughter, a second chance, a family. He wanted to laugh, to shout, to swing her around. But the joy was immediately choked by a cold, sharp terror. He thought of Clay Hackett's face, twisted with hate. Half-breed. He stood abruptly and began to pace the small cabin, his bare feet stirring the dust. A child born of a white man and an Apache woman, in New Mexico territory, in 1878. What world was he bringing this baby into? A world that would hate it, a world that would see it as a sin, a bastard, a thing to be despised. "Daniel?" Tayan asked, her voice small, her smile fading. He ran his hands through his hair, his heart hammering with a new, protective fury. We have to be careful," he muttered. "No one can know, not yet." He was terrified. He was thrilled. He was a father. He needed supplies. He had put it off, but the child changed everything. She would need things. He did not know what. Softer cloth, milk, if he could find a cow to buy. He had to go to town. He left her with a heavy heart. He gave her the rifle and made her promise to keep it loaded, to hide if she saw anyone. She was not to make a fire, not to be seen. She promised, her hand resting on her stomach, a gesture that was already becoming natural. He rode into Santa Fe, his eyes scanning every alley, every roof. The town felt hostile. The air, which had been lazy and warm, now felt charged. He went to the general store, his list in his hand. Silas Cooper served him, his face a sour mask. He would not meet Daniel's eyes. The store was empty, and the silence was heavy. He was loading his sacks onto Sully when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Reed, a moment of your time." Daniel turned. The man was tall and thin, dressed in the same black frock Daniel had seen on the dead man by the wagon. But this man was not dead. His eyes were a pale, cold blue, and his face was pinched with a righteousness that was more dangerous than any bandit. "I am Reverend Pike," the man said, as if Daniel should know the name. "I am here on God's business, and the territories—" "I have no business with you," Daniel said, turning back to his horse. "You have my property, sir," Pike said, his voice sharp. Daniel froze. He turned slowly. "What did you say?" "The Apache girl. Tyan. She is a ward of the mission, entrusted to my care by the United States government to be educated and saved. You abducted her. She was chained to your wagon, half dead and beaten. The bandits left her. I saved her," Daniel snarled. "You stole her. You are harboring a fugitive, and—" Pike's thin lips curled. "You are cohabitating with her in sin. I have papers." He produced a sheaf of documents from his coat. "A legal wardship, signed by the circuit judge. She is to be returned to my custody immediately. She is not property, and she is not going anywhere with you." "Sheriff," Pike called out. Sheriff Brody emerged from his office across the plaza. He was a weary man, his face lined from the sun and the stress of policing a territory that was mostly lawless. He walked toward them, his spurs jingling in the dust. "Daniel," he said, his voice tired. "The Reverend has been to see me. He's got papers. They look legal." "Legal?" Daniel's voice was incredulous. "He's a slaver. He bought her. He claims he was transporting her from a difficult situation," Brody said, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, his papers say she's a ward of the church until she's 21. He's claiming you're holding her against her will. That's a lie." "Then let her come to town and say it," Pike challenged, his blue eyes gleaming. "She's not setting foot in this town," Daniel said, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Daniel, don't," Brody said, his hand on his own weapon. "Don't be a fool. Right now. This is a civil matter. You draw on him, it's murder. He comes near my land, it's self-defense." Daniel said. Pike smiled, a cold, thin expression. "You will be served with a writ. Mr. Reed, you are defying the law. You are defying God." The preacher turned and walked away, his black coat flapping. Brody let out a long breath. He stepped closer to Daniel, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Reed. I don't give a damn what you do on that ridge. But he's right. His papers look good. He's been talking to men, Hackett, Smith. He's telling them you're a squaw man, a sinner, and that you stole a Christian convert." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Brody said, his eyes hard, "that I've got 2 deputies. I can't police the whole county. If Pike comes back and he brings men with him, if he brings a posse to reclaim his property, I can't stop them. The law will be on his side. You'll be on your own." Daniel did not buy the cloth. He left the salt and flour on the street. He mounted Sully and rode out of town, his mind a black storm. He was not just a pariah. He was an outlaw. They would come. They would come for her. And now, they would be coming for his child. He burst into the cabin, his face wild. Tyan was sitting at the table, carefully shaping the letters of her name on a piece of slate. Tyan. She looked up, startled by his panic. "He's here," Daniel said, his voice harsh. "The preacher. The one who owned you. He's in town. He's got papers. He says you're his property." He grabbed his spare rifle from the rack, checking the action. He began stuffing boxes of cartridges into a saddlebag. "What? What does he want?" she asked, standing, her hand on her stomach. "He wants you. He's coming for you. Brody. The sheriff. He won't stop him. They'll come in numbers." He threw the saddlebag at her feet. "We have to go. Now. We can't fight them all. We'll go into the high mountains. We can follow the Rio Grande, up into the high passes. They won't find us there. We can winter in the canyons. We have to leave." He was frantic, grabbing blankets, jerky, his mind racing. He was seeing her chained to the wagon again. He would not let that happen. Tyan watched him. She listened to his words, his panic filling the small room they had built together. He was a soldier, and his instinct was to move, to run, to find a defensible position. She did not move. She was perfectly, terribly still. When he had finished, when he stood breathing heavily, a rifle in one hand and a bag in the other, she finally spoke. She walked past him to the cabin door. She looked out. She looked at the small field of green corn, an impossible splash of life in the dry country. She looked at the new timbers on the roof. She looked at the corral that held his horse and the 2 chickens she fed every morning. She touched the wooden door frame, the wood smooth beneath her hand. Then she turned to face him. Her eyes were not filled with fear. They were hard as the desert rock. "No," she said. "Tyan, you don't understand. They will take you." "No," she repeated, her voice low and absolute. "I will not be stolen again." She stepped toward him. She put her hand on the rifle he held, and gently, firmly, pushed the barrel toward the floor. She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "This," she said, her other hand coming to rest on her belly, "is our place now." Her words, "This is our place now," hung in the air, a declaration that was braver than any bullet. Daniel's panic, the frantic urge to run, cooled. She was right. Running meant they would always be running. Running meant the world was stronger than they were. Here, on this land, he was the hunter. He was the soldier. He was not the prey. "All right," he said, his voice quiet, his mind shifting from flight to a fight. "We stay, but we do it my way." The next 2 days were spent in a grim, silent preparation. He did not fortify the cabin. That was a death trap. Instead, he prepared the land. He took his spare rifle, the heavy sharps, and a box of cartridges, and stashed them in a rocky crevice high up the ridge, a place that gave him a clear view of the cabin and the single trail leading to it. He spent an afternoon clearing brush, creating 2 clear firing lanes. He and Tyan spoke little. The intimacy of the past weeks was replaced by a taut, military focus. He showed her how to reload his pistol, his hands guiding hers until the movements were sure. "If they come," he said, his voice flat, "you do not stay in the cabin. You take this pistol. You run for the high rocks, for the place I showed you. You hide. You do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes dark. "You will fight them." "I will stop them," he said. "We will stop them," she corrected, and her hand went, unconsciously, to her stomach. On the 3rd morning, the sun rose hot and blinding. The air was still, too still. The homestead was on its last canteen of water. The creek was 100 yards down the canyon, a necessary, dangerous trip. "I have to go," he said. "The canteens are dry." "I will come." "No, you stay. You watch." He handed her his field glass. "Watch the trail. 1 rifle shot if you see them. 1. Then you run. Don't wait for me." He hated leaving her. Every instinct screamed against it, but thirst was an enemy that would kill them just as surely as pike. He grabbed the 2 largest wooden buckets and headed down the trail, his rifle in his other hand. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning, his ears straining. Tyan stood on the porch, the rifle heavy in her hands. She watched him disappear into the piñons. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly. She was using the field glass, scanning the ridge, when she saw them. Not on the main trail, but coming over the northern ridge, the hard way, the way they would not be expected. 4 riders. One in a black coat, Clay Hackett, Jeb Smith, the drifter, and Reverend Pike. Her heart did not hammer. It went cold and still. 1 rifle shot. She raised the rifle, aimed at the sky, and fired. The sound cracked across the valley. Then she did as he said. She dropped the rifle, grabbed the pistol he had left for her, and ran. She did not run for the cabin. She ran for the trees. But she was not fast enough. They had heard the shot. They spurred their horses, crashing through the brush, and saw her. "There she is!" Hackett roared, his voice thick with hate. "Grab the squaw!" Tyan ran, barefoot, her feet slipping on the pine needles, but the horses were fast. The drifter cut her off, his horse rearing as he blocked her path. She spun, but Hackett was on her. He launched himself from the saddle, tackling her, his heavy body driving the air from her lungs. She was plunged back into the nightmare, the smell of unwashed wool, of whiskey, the bruising grip, the coldness. She screamed, a raw, animal sound, and fought, her nails raking for his eyes. "Hold still, you heathen bitch!" he snarled, trying to pin her wrists. Pike reined in his horse, his face a mask of pale fury. "Brother Hackett, do not harm her. She is a ward of the church. Bind her." "She needs to be taught a lesson first. Preacher." Hackett grunted, his face close to hers. He was enjoying this. She could feel the brutal anticipation in him. Jeb Smith had a rope. "Just get her tied. We'll take her back to town and let the law handle Reed." Hackett shifted his weight, fumbling for her hands. His grip loosened on one of her arms. In the kitchen, she had been slicing dried apples with her small carving knife. She had tucked it into the waistband of her skirt when she ran. Her hand, free for a second, found the handle. She did not think. She reacted. She pulled the knife and slashed upward, all her strength and terror behind it. Haka_T screamed. It was a high, thin sound. He recoiled, clutching his face. Blood poured through his fingers. The knife had laid his cheek open from the corner of his mouth to his ear. In that moment of shock, Tyan scrambled free. She was on her feet and gone, a deer vanishing into the thick scrub oak. "Get her!" Pike shrieked, his composure shattering. "Don't let her escape!" Jeb and the drifter charged after her, but the terrain was too thick for horses. They dismounted and plunged into the brush. Hackett was on the ground, howling and cursing, his blood staining the dry earth. Daniel heard the shot. His blood turned to ice. He dropped the half-filled buckets and scrambled up the canyon wall, grabbing at roots and rocks, his lungs burning. One shot. Run! She ran. He prayed she had run. He burst onto the flat, his rifle ready. He saw the horses. He saw Hackett on the ground, a pool of blood beside him. He saw Pike, his face a mask of rage. "Reed!" Pike shouted, pointing a pistol. "You will pay for this. She has mutilated my man." "Where is she?" Daniel roared, his voice inhuman. "Gone!" Pike yelled. "Into the rocks! Jeb, find her!" A shout came from the trees. "We got her! Preacher! She's trapped!" Daniel did not wait. He ran past Pike, past the bleeding Hackett, and followed the sounds. He moved with a speed and silence the others did not possess. He was a ghost in the trees, his buckskin shirt blending with the timber. He knew this land. He knew where she would go. There was a series of ledges, a place they had watched hawks from, with a sheer drop to the canyon floor below. It was a dead end. He heard them crashing through the brush ahead of him. He cut left, moving silently over the rockfall. Coming in above them, he found them. Tyan was on the ledge, 10 feet above them, her back to a sheer drop of 200 feet. The carving knife was still in her hand, her knuckles white. She was breathing hard, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, but she was not crying. Jeb Smith and the drifter were below her, trying to find a way up. "Come down, girl," Jeb was saying, his voice a mocking wheedle. "We ain't gonna hurt you. Preacher just wants to talk." "I'll go up," the drifter said, holstering his pistol and grabbing the rock. "You cover me." Daniel raised his rifle. He did not call out. He did not warn them. This was not a fight. This was an execution. He set his sights on the drifter, who was halfway up the rock face. He squeezed the trigger. The .44 caliber slug hit the man in the center of the back. He grunted, his body slamming against the stone, and then he fell, tumbling silently to the base of the cliff. Jeb Smith spun around, his pistol clearing his holster. "What the—" Daniel's second shot was ready. It took Jeb in the chest, spinning him around. He staggered, looked down at the blood blooming on his shirt, and then pitched forward. Silence. The echo of the shots rolled down the canyon. Tyan stared, her hand over her mouth. "Daniel," she whispered. He stepped out from the trees, his rifle still shouldered. Below them, on the trail, Pike appeared, his face white. He looked at the two bodies, then up at Daniel. "Murderer!" he shrieked. "You are a godless killer." Daniel walked down the game trail until he was on the same level as the preacher. He did not lower the rifle. His face was a terrible thing. All emotion burned away, leaving only a cold, deadly calm. "They tried to take her," he said. "She is my ward. The law is on my side." Pike was trembling, but his righteous fury held him together. "You will hang for this. Reed, you and your heathen whore." Daniel's rifle came up, the muzzle aimed not at Pike's chest, but at his face. "You lay hands on her again," Daniel said, his voice a low, grating whisper, "and I will plant you in this dirt." Pike flinched. He saw the truth in Daniel's eyes. This was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. You can't," Pike stammered. "You can't kill a man of God." "I can," Daniel said. Hoofbeats pounded on the trail. "Hold your fire, Reed, in the name of the law." Sheriff Brody appeared, his horse sliding to a stop. He had two deputies with him. They had been on patrol, heard the shots, and come running. Brody took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The two dead men, Pike, pale and shaking, Hackett, stumbling up the trail, his face a mask of blood, and Daniel, his rifle steady, his eyes locked on the preacher. "Reed, put the rifle down, now," Brody commanded. Daniel did not move. He came for her. "Brody, with these men, to take her. He has papers. Son, I told you, this is legal." "Sheriff," Pike cried, finding his courage now that the law was here. "Thank God! This man is a killer! He murdered them! He shot them down without warning! I came to retrieve my legal ward, and he massacred us!" Brody was torn. He looked at Daniel, then at the bodies. It was a bad business. "He is no holy man." The voice came from above. Tyan had climbed down from the ledge. She was barefoot. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was wild, and blood from Hackett's face was smeared on her arm. She was trembling from head to toe, but her spine was straight. Pike's face went white. He had not expected her to speak. She walked until she stood beside Daniel, facing the sheriff. She did not look at Pike. She looked at Brody, and when she spoke, the broken, halting English was gone. In its place was a clear, precise, mission-educated voice that rang with cold authority. "Reverend Pike is a liar. Sheriff," she said. Brody's jaw dropped. The deputies stared. "He did not find me," Tyan continued, her voice gaining strength. "He bought me. He paid $20 silver to a group of ex-soldiers who had captured me. He told me it was the price for my soul. He kept me chained to his wagon for a month. He said it was God's will that I be broken." Pike was sputtering. "Lies. Slander. She is a heathen. She is corrupted by this man." "He is no holy man," Tyan said, her voice cutting through his. "He is a slaver. He told me I was his property. Those men," she pointed at the bodies, "came to steal me. That one," she pointed at Hackett, who was now in the custody of a deputy, "put his hands on me. I cut him. They cornered me. They were going to take me. Daniel saved me." She finally looked at Pike. Her eyes were filled with a loathing so pure it was almost visible. "I am not your ward. I am a free woman, and I am this man's wife." The canyon was silent. Brody looked at Pike, his face hardening. The preacher's righteous story had just been torn to shreds, not by a savage, but by an articulate, composed witness. The deputies, who had been looking at Daniel as a killer, now looked at Pike with open disgust. "Wife?" Brody asked, looking at Daniel. Daniel had not lowered the rifle. "That's what I said. She's mine, my wife." Brody nodded, a slow, grim understanding dawning. He turned to Pike. "Reverend, it seems your papers are based on a lie. You're under arrest for kidnapping, slaver trading, and for inciting this." He gestured to the dead men. "You brought these men here to commit a crime. Their deaths are on your head." "This is an outrage," Pike shrieked. "I am a man of the cloth. You will answer to the church. You will answer to God." "Maybe," Brody said, pulling his handcuffs. "But first, you'll answer to the circuit judge." As the deputies dragged the screaming preacher away, Brody looked at Daniel. He motioned to the bodies. "This is a hell of a mess, Reed. They came to my home to take my wife." "It was self-defense," Daniel said, finally lowering the rifle. Brody sighed. He looked at the bodies, then at Tayenne, who was now leaning against Daniel, her strength fading. "That's how I'll write it. But, Daniel, you made enemies today. The preacher has friends. Hackett's family has money. This town, it's not going to forget this. Let them remember," Daniel said. "Just so long as they remember to stay away." Brody nodded. He mounted his horse. "You bury these men. Bury them deep." He rode off, leaving them in the sudden, ringing silence of the canyon. Daniel turned to Tayenne. The trembling had taken over her body. Violent shudders. The terror she had held back now consumed her. He dropped the rifle and gathered her into his arms, lifting her as he had the day he found her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her back to the cabin, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. The cabin was a wreck. The door was splintered, the table overturned. The small slate she had been writing on was shattered on the floor. He did not put her down. He sat in his chair, the one she had sat in when she was sick, and held her, cradling her as she wept. She cried silently, her body shaking, her face pressed into his neck. He said nothing. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his own body aching with the aftermath of the fight. He held her for a long time, until the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows into the cabin. Her shaking finally subsided. He pulled back, holding her face in his hands. Her eyes were swollen, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He gently wiped the blood stain from her arm. "It's over," he whispered, his voice raw. "No more running. Ever. You're safe. I swear it. You're safe." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, her tear-soaked eyelids. He kissed her mouth, a desperate, affirming kiss that was not about passion, but about life, a promise. "This land," he said, looking around the broken room. "It's not just my land. This is yours. Tayenne, this is our place. No one will ever take you from it again." She nodded, her breath hitching. She was exhausted, her body drained, her mind bruised. That night, he cleaned the cabin, repaired the door, and laid her in the cot. He was going to sleep on the floor, to stand watch, but she would not let him. She needed him close. He lay beside her, holding her, the rifle leaning against the wall, within arm's reach. He listened to the night sounds, every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl. He would not sleep. Not tonight. He felt her stir. Hours later, in the deep dark, she did not wake from a nightmare. She was quiet, contemplative. She took his hand, the one that had held the rifle, the one that had saved her, and she guided it. She pressed his palm flat against her belly. The skin was warm. He could feel the slight, firm swell beneath. The child, in the terror and the blood, he had forgotten. "The deer," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound in the darkness. It is still with me? He closed his eyes. She was not just telling him she was unhurt. She was telling him that what Pike and Hackett had tried to kill, their life, their future, was safe. It was still there. A small, stubborn spark of life. He realized then that he had not just been fighting for her. He had been fighting for his child, his family. He pressed his hand firmer, as if he could protect the life inside her with his touch alone. Yes, he whispered back, his throat closing. Yes, it is. And I'll keep it safe. I'll keep you both safe. The valley healed. The dead were buried, deep in the rocky soil far from the cabin, and the land's memory of the violence began to fade. The bloodstains on the earth were washed away by the spring rains. The fear in the cabin did not vanish overnight, but it receded, replaced by a fierce, quiet vigilance. And then, slowly, by the mundane and powerful rhythms of a life that was determined to continue. Spring arrived in the high desert not as a gentle greening, but as a raw, windy rebirth. The aspens on the high ridges budded, their leaves a pale, trembling green against the dark pines. The creek, swelled with snowmelt, rushed cold and loud, and Tyen grew. Her pregnancy, hidden for the first months, became an undeniable fact, a rounding of her small frame that changed the very center of gravity in their home. She moved more slowly, with a new deliberation, one hand often resting on the swell of her belly. The deer, she called it, the small, secret life that was now pressing outward. Daniel watched her, his terror from the day of the fight slowly transforming into a raw, protective awe. He had fought for her. Now, he must build for her. He looked at the cabin, his one-room fortress of solitude, and saw it was no longer enough. It was a shelter for one, and a cramped space for two. It was not a home for three. He began to work. He took his axe and his saw and went to the woods, felling trees with a new, focused energy. He was not just splitting firewood. He was hewing beams. He knocked down the wall of the small, cold room he had first built for her, the room that had been her cage and then her refuge. He tore it down, and in its place, he built outward. He worked from sunup to sundown. The sound of his hammer and saw echoed through the valley. He was expanding the cabin, adding a new, proper room, one with a wide window to catch the morning light. He built it strong. The timbers chinked tight against the wind. It was a room for the child. Tyen would sit on the porch, stitching soft deerskin he had tanned, her eyes following him. She was making small clothes, impossibly small, sewn with a bone needle and sinew. She watched his muscles work, watched the sweat on his back. She saw the same strength he had used to kill the men who had come for her, now being used to build a roof. The two things, the violence and the tenderness, were in him, one and the same. When the room was finished, the walls smelling of fresh-cut pine, he did not stop. He spent days searching the creek bed, looking for the right piece of wood. He found a piece of smooth, pale aspen, cured dry by the sun. He brought it into the cabin, and in the evenings, by the firelight, he began to carve, his hands, thick and calloused, scarred from war and work, moved with a surprising delicacy. Tyen watched him, her head tilted. As the wood chips fell, he was making a cradle. It was not a fine or fancy thing. It was solid, deep, and strong. He sanded it with smooth stones until the wood felt like silk. When he was finished, he set it in the new room, in the patch of sunlight from the new window. He did not stop there. The protective, joyful energy consumed him. He carved small, simple toys, his mind filled with the image of a small hand reaching. He carved a deer, its head high, in memory of her dream. He carved a small, smooth bird. He carved a rough, solid horse, just like Sully. He lined them up on the windowsill, a small, silent herd waiting. As her time grew near, their roles reversed. She, who had learned his world, now began to teach him hers. In the evenings, she would hum the low, melodic songs of her people. "You must learn," she told him, her hand on her belly. "The baby, It knows my voice. It must know yours. I can't sing. Tie in, he said, his voice rough. You can, she insisted. She began a song, a simple, repetitive chant. It was a lullaby, she explained, to soothe the child. It spoke of the wind in the pines, of the hawk on the wing, of the safety of the fire. He tried. His voice was a low, tuneless rumble, butchering the soft Apache words. She laughed, the sound light, and made him try again, and again. He sat beside her, his head bent, and he learned. He learned the songs of a people he had once been paid to fight, so that he could sing his own child to sleep. The old primer lay on the table, unused for a time. One night, Tyan picked it up. She had learned to read the simple words, dog, run, house, fire. But now, she pointed to the one that had puzzled her, Love. I know this word, she said, tracing the letters. It is the warm. It is what stays. She looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. But it is more now. He took the book from her. He did not need it. He took her hand and placed it on her belly, where the child was moving. A small, strong kick. This, he said, his voice thick. He then put her hand on his own heart, which hammered steadily beneath her palm. And this, he pointed to the cradle, to the small, carved deer, to the new walls of the room he had built. That, he said, is love. It is not just a word. It's the work. She looked at the cradle, at his hands, at her own belly. She finally understood. It was not a feeling. It was a thing. A solid thing you could build, and fight for, and hold. She nodded, a slow, deep understanding. The work, she repeated. Yes. They had to go to town. The baby was coming. And they needed flour, salt, and, more than anything, cloth, soft cloth. Daniel dreaded it. He had not seen a single person since the day he had buried the preacher's men. Brody had never come back. The world had left them alone. He did not want to poke the hornet's nest. I will go, he said. You will stay. No, Tyan said. Her voice was quiet, but absolute. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found. She was the mistress of his home, the mother of his child. I will not hide. You said this is my place. I am your wife. I will ride with you. He argued, but it was useless. Her mind was set. They rode into Santa Fe 2 days later. He rode Sully, his rifle in its scabbard, his pistol on his hip. She rode the mule he had bought, sitting straight and proud. Her hair was in its married braids, and her condition was obvious to anyone who looked. The plaza went silent. It was as if he had thrown a switch. Men who had been talking stopped, their mouths open. Women who had been sweeping their stoops froze, their brooms still. Every eye in Santa Fe turned to them. To the gaunt, bearded killer, Daniel Reed, and his pregnant Apache wife. He felt the hatred, the fear, the disgust rolling off them in waves. He kept his hand near his gun, his eyes scanning the rooftops, his body rigid. Tyan, however, looked straight ahead. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. She was, he realized, braver than he was. He dismounted and tied the horses. He helped her down from the mule, his hand protectively on her back. They walked into the general store. Silas Cooper was there. His face went pale, as if he had seen a ghost. Reed, he stammered. Silas, Daniel said. He handed him a list. Flour, salt, coffee, lard, and 10 yards of your softest flannel. Silas scrambled to fill the order, his hands shaking so badly he spilled cornmeal on the floor. He would not look at Tyan, would not even glance in her direction. He weighed the goods, overcharged them by at least 30%, and took Daniel's coin. Daniel was loading the sacks onto the mule when a man stepped out of the saloon. It was Jedediah Miller, the owner of the ranch where Hackett and Smith had worked. He was an old man, his face like cured leather, his eyes hard. He was not a fool, and he was not a coward. He walked straight up to Daniel. Reed, Miller said, his voice clear in the silence. Daniel stopped loading. He turned. Miller, I buried 2 of my men because of you, Miller said. They came to my home. Miller, to steal my wife, Daniel said, his voice low. Miller looked past Daniel, at Tyann, who stood by the mule, her hand on her belly. He saw her, really saw her, not as a squaw, but as a young woman, proud and defiant. His hard gaze softened. Just a fraction. He sighed. A long, weary sound. This is bad business. Reed, the whole town, they're spooked. They say you're a killer. They say things about her. I don't care what they say, Daniel said. You should. Miller said, it ain't safe for you. It ain't safe for that. Why, Reed? Why stay with her? You know what this world is. It's just trouble. Why? It was the question the whole town wanted to ask. Daniel felt Tyann's gaze on his back. He did not have to think about the answer. He had been thinking about it for months. He looked the old rancher in the eye. Because she's mine, he said, his voice simple and clear, carrying across the silent plaza. And I'm hers. It was an answer so final, so absolute, that there was nothing more to be said. Miller stared at him for a long moment, then just shook his head, turned, and walked back into the saloon. Daniel finished loading the mule. He and Tyann mounted up. They rode out of Santa Fe, the eyes of the town following them until they were just a speck on the trail. They were, for good or ill, left alone. The summer burned into fall. The aspens turned a fiery, impossible gold. The nights grew sharp, promising the first snow. Tyann was heavy, her movement slow, her time near. The storm broke on a cold night in late October. It was not a gentle rain. It was a return to the violence of the land. A furious high-country thunderstorm that brought wind, then sleet, then snow. The wind shrieked, slamming against the new walls of the cabin. Thunder cracked, echoing off the canyon walls. Tyann woke him, her hand gripping his. Daniel, it is time. The words he had been waiting for and dreading. He flew into action. He built the fire up until it roared, heating water, his mind racing. He was a soldier. He was a builder. He was not a midwife. His only experience with birth was the one that had stolen Alara. The memory sent a spike of pure, cold panic through his heart. The labor was long. The storm outside matched the one inside. 4 hours. Tyann paced, her face a mask of concentration, breathing through the pain. As the night wore on, the pain grew, and she moved to the bed he had built, her hands gripping the wooden frame until her knuckles were white. Daniel could do nothing. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He gave her water. He spoke soothing words that felt hollow and useless. He watched her suffer, and the old terror crept back. It's been too long, he said, his voice tight, his pacing frantic. This is how it was before. Tyann, it's not right. It's too hard. He was panicking. He was seeing Alara's pale, exhausted face. He was failing again. Tyann, in the deep, agonizing grip of a contraction, opened her eyes and looked at him. She saw his fear. She saw his ghost, and in the center of her own pain, she found the strength to save him. She reached out, her hand weak, but her grip iron. Daniel, stop! He froze. Look at me, she commanded, her voice a raw gasp. He knelt by the bed. Listen. He could hear the wind howling like a wolf, the crack of the thunder. We are both made from storms, she breathed, her eyes locking with his. We were born in them. This is how she will come. Do not be afraid. Be strong. Be the work. Be the work. His own word. It was as if she had struck him. His panic shattered. She was right. This was not a memory. This was now. This was his wife. This was his child. He was not a helpless spectator. He was her husband. I'm here, he said, his voice steady again. He took her hand. I'm with you. I'm not afraid. The final hours were a blur of pain and prayer and effort. He held her. He supported her. He whispered the Apache lullabies he had learned, his rough voice a counterpoint to her cries in the storm's roar. Just as the false dawn was lighting the sky, the storm reached its peak. A bolt of lightning struck the ridge above the cabin, the crack simultaneous with the flash. In that moment of electric silence, Tyen gave a final, desperate cry, and it was answered by another. A thin, reedy, furious wail. It cut through the sound of the thunder, through the howling wind. It was the sound of life. Daniel's hands shook so hard he could barely hold the knife. He did what he had to do. His vision blurred. He cleaned the baby, his rough hands clumsy, his heart exploding. A girl. A small, perfect, healthy girl. She had a full head of dark hair, matted and wet. He wrapped her in the new flannel and laid her on Tyen's chest. Tyen was exhausted, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow, but she smiled. She touched the baby's face. Daniel sank to the floor, his back against the wall, and he wept. He cried for Alara, for the child he had lost. He cried for the men he had killed, and he cried for the impossible, perfect joy of the small, wailing life that had just entered his home. They named her as the storm passed and the first true light of morning, clean and cold, filled the new room. The baby opened her eyes. They were not dark, like her mother's. They were a pale, clear gray, like the sky after a storm. Like his. "Nantani," Tyen whispered, her voice rough. She looked at Daniel. "It is from my people. It means she brings light." "Nantani Reed," Daniel said, tasting the name. "She brings light, yes." The fall was gentle that year, as if the land itself wanted to give them peace. The winter was mild. Nantani grew. The cabin was filled with new sounds, not just the crackle of fire and the whisper of wind, but the gurgle of a baby and the low, soft rumble of Daniel's voice singing Apache lullabies. One afternoon, in the following spring, they sat beneath the great cottonwood tree by the creek. The air was warm, and the leaves were that new, bright green. Daniel was leaning against the trunk, and Tyen was resting between his knees, her back against his chest. Nantani was asleep in her mother's arms, her small face peaceful. It was a moment of complete, unblemished peace. They sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the creek and the wind. Tyen looked down at the sleeping child. She studied the impossible fusion of their two worlds, the dark, fine hair of her own people, the pale, clear eyes of his. She touched the baby's soft cheek. She tilted her head back to look up at Daniel, a small, curious smile playing on her lips. "So," she whispered, her mind reaching back to a girl who had known nothing of tenderness. "This is how white people make children." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. I think I understand now." Daniel smiled. The scars on his face, the lines of grief and violence, softened. He leaned down, his beard brushing her hair, and kissed the top of her head. He looked from his wife to his child. "No," he replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "We made her, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this. We look forward to reading your thoughts in English.